Problem. Yeah.
Okay, welcome to our webinar on Vietnam domestic tourism. This is the fourth tea time chat. Hope you guys have a warm tea or coffee in your, or Vietnamese coffee in your hand. I know it's 9 p.m. there. I know it's Japan 11 p.m. But hopefully you can still enjoy your tea time while listening to this. I'm very happy to welcome our fantastic speakers here today. We have Dr. Dong. She's a Vice Dean at Faculty of Tourism Studies at Vietnam National University in Hanoi. And Dr. Dong's research area is hospitality management, and she's just finishing her research project in business ethics in among hotels in Vietnam. Welcome, Dr. Dong.
Yay. Good evening, everybody.
Hello. And we
Hello.
have Dr. Huang Bui. She's an associate professor at APU Japan, and she recently published the book Tourism and Development in Southeast Asia. So if you're interested in tourism and development in Southeast Asia topic, look her up and look up her book. It has really interesting chapters there. Congratulations, Dr. Bui.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Vietnamese, but now I've been locked down in Japan. So yeah, I really miss Vietnam, and I think it's almost my summer holiday, and I return to Vietnam every year. But this year, for some reason, everyone know what is the reason? I cannot do it.
Yeah, but thanks so much for joining us at late at night in Japan. It's 11 p.m. there, right? Thank you so much. And we have Dr. Long. He's an associate professor and dean at the Faculty of Tourism Studies at Vietnam National University in Hanoi. And Dr. Long's research areas are community-based tourism, ecotourism, and tourism policies. And Dr. Long and I have done various projects together. I would say they have been quite successful, and Dr. Dong as well. And we are currently organizing a special issue on sustainable tourism development in Southeast Asia. So hopefully we see this issue to be published next year. Right? So stay tuned. And last but not least, we have a Dr. Dr. Long, you want to say something?
No, thank you for organizing this online talk so we can chit and chat about Vietnam tourism. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Long. And we have a Dr. Nuno Ribeiro. He's a senior lecturer at RMIT University Vietnam in Ho Chi Minh City. And Dr. Nuno Ribeiro's research areas about how culture impacts travel behavior and how different stakeholders can use this knowledge for optimizing tourism services, facilities, and industry. That quite fits perfectly for today's conversation of how domestic tourists kind of behave differently compared to international tourists. So Southeast Asia in general have been kind of focusing on international tourists, right? Research, government data, it's all about foreign tourists, but now it's kind of time to focus on domestic tourist behavior and what they like, what they prefer as well. So I'm kind of excited to chat about this. And there's not much information out there how Vietnamese domestic tourism been kind of working and operating or even enjoying, right? So I really appreciate your time, especially gaining this local knowledge. Before we start our discussion, Dr. Dong, can I ask you a personal question?
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, I know you just came back from your own holiday in Vietnam, right? Can I ask where you been and what you did?
Last week I went on holiday in Phu Quoc with my family. Phu Quoc, as you know, Phu Quoc is an island in North with a very pleasant climate. So we stay 4 days and have also a lot of interesting activities. As you know, Phu Quoc has many beautiful beaches. So for Vietnamese tourists, beach is really very wonderful for them. And the most famous and wild is the Star Beach in Phu Quoc, and we visited the Star Beach. And so, we also went to some nearby islands for diving and seeing corals. It's very fantastic. And additionally, we went to some fishing village to wait for the sunrise. And I took some photos for when I pick up the sunrise. And there are there are many entertainment areas and theme park there, and safari, water park, cable car. Yes, they're very so many interesting activities. And we also try seafood, of course, and many local dishes there. And we did not forget to buy some Chinese things, Chinese food, such as fish sauce, pepper, dry seafood, and of course I like pure jewelries. So I buy some for me and friends.
Oh, that's great.
And
But Dr. Dong,
wonderful trip. And I spent the whole day to take a look into the accommodation system in Phu Quoc.
Oh, okay.
Now do a research in resort in Vietnam, and Phu Quoc has many luxurious 5-star hotels and resorts. And I pay much time to look into some hotels and luxury hotels and resorts in Phu Quoc.
Okay. Really interesting.
Yes, very interesting.
But do you think that Phu Quoc aim at domestic tourists or international tourists, a luxury accommodation system? Do they serve for domestic or international?
I think you know there are more and more luxury hotels and resorts in Phu Quoc, and I think anything for domestic tourists, and for both domestic tourists and international tourists, they concerned to luxury accommodation. And I think it's the suitable time for the domestic tourism to experience the luxurious accommodation, because all of them, all hotels and resorts in Phu Quoc now, they give the very big sale for the accommodation, and it's a good chance for the tourists, for domestic tourists to experience.
Then moving on to our discussion, four of you, what have you been observing as kind of differences between domestic tourists and international tourists? Like what domestic tourists prefer in terms of destination choices or tourist activities? Are they really different?
Yes. I would refer to, I actually did research on domestic tourists, and I published a couple of papers on domestic tourists in Vietnam. And what I observed and what I wrote in my paper is first, the domestic tourists really reflects a collective conscious, collectivism. So they go in a group, usually go with a group of family members. But there was a very unique system in socialism. Country is the organization organize the trip for their workers. So it's organized by Công đoàn or the trade union. So the trade union also in charge of kind of taking care of health and wellness and welfare for their workers. So they organize that trip, and you might ask Long and Dung, they do know that usually the workers and the co-worker actually travel together for summer holiday, and it's sponsored by the organization. So that is really a big hit and big tip to boost the domestic tourists, particularly group tours. And in terms of the second point I want to make is part of collective cultures, organizational culture inherited from socialism system. In terms of destination, they tend to kind of choosing very popular destination, which is everyone recommend, and sometimes they look for more trendy. So they believe on word of mouth or kind of certain trend. For example, maybe this year is Phu Quoc, for example, going to be quite a trendy destination. And they do look for more like a popular destination, and are less likely to take risks for new destination. Maybe the young people, but generally holiday makers, they won't look for that type of destination. In terms of activities, because of the group travel, and often they buy tour or organize a tour by a travel company. So it pretty have a fixed itinerary and mainly for relaxing, for family get together or co-worker for team building, even in summer break. And I'm pretty sure that when people travel domestically, they sort of kind of free from daily kind of liminal status, like a free from constraint, free from being observed, free from daily work, and summer holiday when the kids also have a break. So it's so much into like they are kind of enjoying and also for spending. So they do spend a lot, and the spending pattern by domestic tourists is compared to international tourists, daily spending even more than international tourists.
Okay, that's a
Actually,
good
they
info.
spend more, and they actually look also kind of like as a nouveau rich class. They're looking for luxury accommodation, and they eat in a very fine dining restaurant. They do spend more, but the problem is they usually travel pretty short. So in terms of total spending, it might not be compatible. And how the tourism sector react? I think for so long, the Vietnam still look at international tourists as a driving force, and all statistics only focus on international tourists. But the ratio for international and domestic is about 1 to 10. And with the increasing spending power, we do see the domestic tourist is really potential. And it's not just like spending, maybe it reflects a bit of, because I have a background in anthropology, so I would explain it from also Southeast Asian characteristic, which is like a more like easygoing, enjoying life, not so much stressful. So so that pattern, that kind of thing is a little bit different from Japanese or Korean. They do enjoy, and Vietnamese do enjoy our life, and life is pretty easy going for them. So that's why when they're on holiday, they tend to spend, they tend to enjoy, and they tend to free themselves from a lot of constraint. Yeah, and I see the tourism still do a lot of packaging promotion, heavily promotion, but now I also read the news that many sort of package doesn't really work well because the partner doesn't work with each other to make the package happen, and also impose quite a lot of pressures on the current system. So far, that is my initial research. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I've been following the market somewhat closely. I serve on several committees that are related to the latest statistics to domestic and international tourists in Vietnam, both with AmCham, AusCham, and now Eurocham. There are greater numbers of domestic tourisms, but per capita, they do tend to spend less. And the attitudes are changing. While it was true that some emphasis on corporate sponsored work, trips are still existing, they still happen on a weekend. There are some resorts where the mainstay is still corporate stay. The hope is that, for example, we are right in the midst of a government-sponsored campaign, which is rediscovering Vietnam. There is an entire group of domestic tourists who would take their trips abroad, but now, the borders are closed, so they can't go. And interestingly, their children who are now upper millennials are now acquiring habits very comparable to affluent millennials anywhere in the world. And they are, to some extent, duplicating the same spending habits. On the whole, however, the statistics that we have available from VNA, FINA Capital, and a few other, the World Bank has just released a report. We have about an average where domestic tourists tend to spend between 3 and 4 days, with the exception of those who are localized near coastal destinations. They might leave on Saturday, return on Sunday, and now we're just about to enter the summer break. So they're likely to take their children, then the average stay is between 8 and 11 days. What it has happened now that we went from literally 100 to 0 in regard to international tourists, we've had a massive decrease in the arrival of international tourists, particularly from the two major markets, China and Korea, that together, as you know, they're more than 50%. So I'm a perpetual optimist. There are no cloud without a silver lining. So here it has forced a variety of tourism providers to rethink that perhaps this dependency is not ideal. And certainly there is always more potential. This doesn't happen just in Vietnam, it happens in any country in the world. There's always more potential with domestic tourists than there is with international tourism, simply because the numbers are greater, with the exception of island economies. The issue for us is that Vietnamese tourists tend to spend less per capita than international tourists, which is also very understandable. We do hope that destinations like Phu Quoc, like Sapa, like Oei Han, which up until now have very much catered primarily to international tourists, they've had to pivot. And they've had to offer either programs or activities, or even in some cases change the pattern of their accommodations to fit more the domestic market. I'll give you an example. So right now, the three most active markets are Saigon, Hanoi, and the little corridor between Da Nang and Nha Trang, the coastal areas. So you have large hotel brands like Intercontinental who are surviving because they have residential expats staying and can't leave. At the same time, they're doing activities on weekends that ordinarily they would have done 2 or 3 years ago to attract domestic tourists. They are focusing more on families. They're focusing more on corporate retreats, value in the sense that they may offer a meal in addition to breakfast, which up until then it was not necessary to do. A point just very quickly in regard to room rates. I think Dr. Jung mentioned that point correctly. I mean, I'm going to hotels that I ordinarily wouldn't visit, you know, because they're pretty cheap. Right, you know, on a professor salary, there's only so many 5-star hotels that you can visit. One concern that that the large, not just international brands, but Mung Tang Hospitality has done that too, is to what extent can they lower their rack rates? Will that create an artificial sense of stability? We don't know this. We know for sure it will rebound, certainly. I think it's inevitable. But right now, you're having, for example, in Phu Quoc, Kanto, Da Nang, you are having 5-star bespoke luxuries that used to be, you know, 12 million a night. They're now 4. You know, the Intercontinental Phu Quoc, I saw the other day, $1 million too, and I'm like, oh, well, wait a minute, I might go for a weekend myself. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I am an optimist. I'm a strong believer in Vietnamese tourism. We've been growing by double digits the last 10 years or so. Lots of potential in domestic tourism. And we just had a survey yesterday that blew my mind away. They interviewed millennials about their shopping habits in large shopping centers in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And the largest percentage of their discretionary income went for the very first time in Vietnam's history to travel and leisure. And I thought it was remarkable. So we might have an entire new generation of travelers who is just ready to rediscover Vietnam. So let's hope so.
Really interesting. Thanks, Nuno. Dr. Dung, do you have anything to add? Are you on mute? Oh, yeah. Oh.
I just want to add some information. So actually in Vietnam, you know that we have now is more than 93 million of Vietnamese people, right? And every year, many Vietnamese people travel around Vietnam. So last year is more than 80 million Vietnamese people traveling around Vietnam. It doesn't mean 80 million. Just like some people like me, I travel a lot in Vietnam. Like I think I like more than 55 times per year around Vietnam. But anyway, many Vietnamese people nowadays traveling around Vietnam. So it means that Vietnam tourism have many chances to promote domestic tourism. And the number of international tourists coming to Vietnam is quite less than the domestic tourists. Last year is just 18 million. So comparing between the number, I think if we focusing both international and domestic tourists, but when comparing with the domestic tourists, I agree with Dr. Hương that they tend to spend a lot on dining. When they eat or they drink, Vietnamese people don't care much about money. If they have money, especially in the southern part of Vietnam, if they have money and they can spend on for drinking and eating, right? So that is one important thing I want to remind. And also for the time, normally Vietnamese people travel, I agree that they travel very short, like 2 or 4 days, but in the summer, if they go with the family, they normally spend like one week. I guess so, around 1 week. But quite seasonal, because normally in the summer and also in the spring, in other season like autumn and winter, they tend to stay at home, because in the autumn it's like working, and the student the people have to go to school. The student have to go to school, so they tend to stay at home. And also in the winter, it's in the northern part of Vietnam, it's quite cold, so not so many northern people traveling around Vietnam in the winter. So how about the staying? They normally staying in, I think, 2 or 3 star hotel. Let people staying at the 4 and 5 star hotel. Why? Because mostly Vietnamese people have low income, especially those who work in the factory. When they travel with the big group, collective group, Dr. Hương mentioned, organized by the trade union, they normally staying in the 2 or 3 star hotel. So how about their spending? They tend to spend more on eating and drinking than for staying. And they also Vietnamese people, when they traveling around Vietnam, they would like to buy some of the local product, mostly for food and beverage. It's not for like clothes or for shoe or something like that. They tend to spend on the food and beverage, bring the souvenir back to for their family. So that's something I want to input for the domestic tourists. Yeah.
Very interesting.
And,
yeah.
At the moment, we are. If you go to the airport, you can see a lot of Vietnamese people gather in the airport, like packed with the people in the airport. It means that nowadays domestic tourists seem to be like on air, is flying. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the pandemic hit just at the time when we had Vietjet just increasing the number of routes. We had Bamboo Air that in the last 2 years took another set of routes. Vietnam Airlines opened a few more, especially to destinations up until then didn't have daily flights. I find it interesting because that's my experience as well, Dr. Long, with the percentage of daily spending going to food and beverage. And I have to wonder sometimes, especially when I travel with my Vietnamese colleagues, where does the food go, right? Because it is a huge percentage of the average expenditures of a given family during their leisure and family travel. I'm wondering, however, if that might change with the current generations. And I speak only for the young people that I interact with, who are my students. They're in their late teens, early 20s. A little bit older if they're my master or PhD students. And I think we may witness a birth of a new travel class. They travel in groups, but the groups are somewhat small, between 3 and 6 people. And I I find it fascinating because their travel habits right now seem to be breaking from the habits that they had either with their families or when they went on school trips. They seem a lot more aligned with, you know, what the Chinese, you know, call the donkey friends, not the backpackers. They're not Thai Balo, not that. Or I guess we'd call them Viet Balo or something. They're not there. It's a little bit more.
I know that concept.
Right? It's
Donkey friend.
it's not the backpack, it's something in between.
Flash packer.
Right, exactly. And I think we may, you know, the wheel may be turning. You know, we may be witnessing it now. One thing I think Marriott and Intercontinental, I think they did this. They now have packages that they are marketing specifically for this travel segment for young, not necessarily affluent, but middle class and up or upper middle class young Vietnamese who are willing to travel. And I found that very interesting. Could it be that we are witnessing the birth of a new market here? We don't know much about them other than, you know, where they like to spend money, the typical destinations. We know that they're quasi-dependent on social media. A big part of their experience happens post-travel with the sharing of their experience on social media. But I found it interesting, Dr. Long, I saw a survey done by the People's Committee here in Ho Chi Minh City with young travelers, and the amount of money that they spend on food and beverage is still high. So maybe that is some part of national culture. Okay, no matter where I travel, I'm gonna make sure I eat really well. If I go to Phu Quoc, I have to buy Nuoc Mam because it's where it's made. If I'm gonna go to Da Nang, I'm gonna have 5 different types of seafood. I found that fascinating.
I guess in the part, a lot of Vietnam people hunger for eating. So it becomes, yes, after the
consumptions.
When they have like become richer and they have money, so they will tend to spend money on eating and drinking. Because like me, when I was young, at the age of 10, I didn't have enough food to eat. I couldn't have rice and even meat for eating. So later on, life getting better, and we can have meat and everything to eat. So I think a lot of people like that. They seem in the past they didn't have enough food to eat, and even the beverage to drink. So now, when the life getting better, they travel and they eating and drinking.
Yeah.
We do see that it's part of the Asian culture where we do emphasize on the importance of food and the food experience when they travel. So spending on food, people might not hesitate. They might hesitate on spending on activity, but not for food and drink. Part of
so it sounds like obviously domestic tourists are different from international tourists with their preferences and behavior, and it sounds like there's a different layers of various markets within domestic market. It's not one market, right? Yes. Then with this new demands and new emerging trends and preferences, how can tourism sector react to this, or have they been reacting to these new demands and preferences? Have you observed anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think Dr. Jung was the first one to mention this, that their first reaction was to cut their rack rates. You know, the domestic tourism is somewhat price sensitive. They're somewhat price elastic. They've been cutting those rates. The type of stays that they provide match the travel preferences that we've just discussed. Instead of providing packages for 2 or 3 nights, they're providing packages for 4 nights. They're, instead of charging per person, which used to be sort of the default, they're now charging per room. They understand that some domestic markets, because they travel with family, they may have 2, 3, 4 people in the room that might have just 2. Maybe they have young children, maybe an aging parent. But I think they're wise to try and capture this market. They're doing the best they can. Now, what I'm not so sure is whether the international brands are willing to pivot enough. I think a lot of, especially the large chains, I think they're still holding their breath. And they're still thinking, you know what, we're going to get to Tet, or we're going to be after Tet and the borders are going to open and everything will be back to normal. I don't share that. I think there will be a new normal. And at least in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, because we're probably going to be the first ones to get out of the crisis, to not cater more to the domestic market, I think would be a mistake.
Thanks, Nuno. Anybody else to add to this?
Yes, I'm very happy to be the last person to express my opinion, and I have nearly 30 minutes to listen to all of you, and I agree with a lot of your opinion, but there are some something that I want to add here. I agree with Mr. Long and Ms. Hương about the expand that the domestic tourists. As you know, before we often think that the Vietnamese domestic tourists not spend much money when they travel, but now it's trend. And according to the accommodation, I mean the hotels and resorts, the domestic tourists, they spend much, not for rooms, not for food and beverage, but also for the supplementary service. I mean the bar, the spa, and some sport games in the sea. And the second one I want to ask, the problem that the accommodation like hotels and resorts have to face to when they pick up a lot of domestic tourists is that the domestic tourists often eat a lot, often eat drink lots, and they waste a lot, you know, and Vietnamese domestic tourists seems to be thought that they don't have the habit and conscious to save energy. I mean the electricity in rooms. Sometimes they didn't cut off the electricity when they go out, for example, and they maybe sometimes they don't have the conscious to protect the environment, and that is one of the difficulty for the hotels and resorts when they pick up a big amount of domestic at the same time, domestic tourists at the same time.
I guess it's going to be a very big question for Phu Quoc, for waste management.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
also other destinations in Vietnam.
Huge. Right now, we're towards the tail end of the season. Big parts of Phu Quoc are dealing with that. We deal with it here in Saigon every time it rains. It will be interesting to see if tourism providers, from a sustainable development perspective, can we force this big, huge market that is the domestic tourism to sort of spread themselves a little bit thinner rather than focus on the 8 or 10 destinations that year after year receive increasing numbers of visitors because some of them are not sustainable. I don't know how many of you have driven recently south from the Nang to Nha Trang, but it's just construction after construction, right? A lot of them are stopped right now because of COVID, but huge resorts are just getting built right now. And the coastline, as you know, can only take so many tourists.
Is there any government interest want to encourage people to go to these unexplored rural places? Because Thailand has this new investment in rural villages.
I just want to mention that. In Vietnam, for the Thai tourism, the Vietnamese tourism administration of tourism is focusing on there are 4 types of tourism. One is cultural tourism. Second is ecotourism. the third one is city tourism, and the last one is beach and sea tourism. But mostly Vietnamese people tend to go to the beach and also sea tourism and also city tourism rather than ecotourism and also the cultural tourism. For like Vietnamese people lazy to go to the museum, something like that. They tend to enjoy to the beach. And also, yes,
they love
yes.
resort.
Yes.
So they go for relaxing, it's not for learning.
Yes.
For learning. And that's why when Dung mentioned that like Vietnamese people tend to less responsible on natural resources. I agree that.
This can become our future project on this, right?
So this is a,
I think that's a very big topic, how to make the domestic tourism sustainable in a large scale. And
that's our next webinar topic.
And you know,
yes.
And just one. And a lot of international corporations, hotel corporations in Vietnam, international brand, they find it. They find the problem of protect the environment of domestic tourists is a big problem, and now they do not have the practical solution for this problem. Yes.
So this is something we can work on in the future for other researchers or industry people, right?
Yes,
so this kind of gives a good food for thoughts for people who are kind of interested in doing research in domestic tourism in Vietnam, right? I know we have actually already 30 minutes. Do you have anything to add about domestic tourism in Vietnam before we go? This has been really useful,
That is a very interesting and very useful discussion, even though it's 30 minutes, but we touch all big issues.
Yeah, definitely,
And it might take centuries to solve it.
Yes, sometimes we find out the topic that we can research later on, right? So,
exactly. Right? The domestic sustainable consumption. There's a lot of ideas come up from this little tea talk.
3 of us can meet in person.
What about
I envy you? I envy you. I don't know when I could meet people in person.
I know, right? But this has been really interesting and useful. Thank you so much for your thoughtful insights. I'm sure people are getting.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting this webinar and very lively discussions. And I hope to see you soon.
Hopefully see you soon. Let's do this again in 3 months or so and talk more about how has been.
I like this idea. If you host like a more systematic and we can meet again and chat again and maybe bring more people come in and have a diverse view.
That's
and
great.
Definitely very fruitful discussion to ground for research later on.
That'd be interesting.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Soon I'll pay my colleagues a visit.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe and hopefully see you soon.
Have a nice weekend.
Have a nice
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Come on.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. See you.